Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a real honor and a privilege to spend a couple of hours chatting with you about workplace harassment and some of the recent developments that we've seen in the last 6 months or so related to these issues. My name is Tracy Park. I'm an attorney at Burke Williams & Sorensen. I am a partner in our Labor and Employment Practice Group. I represent cities and other public entities around the state of California in a wide range of workplace litigation matters, but primarily the cases I handle work on or involve workplace harassment, discrimination, and retaliation. For many, many years now, I have been actively engaged in workplace training for our clients around the state of California and have spent a lot of time in individual workplaces doing state-mandated workplace harassment training. This is not that training. Today, Lauren and I are going to talk about some of the changing cultural norms, the impact of the Me Too movement, as well as take a deeper dive into some specific issues that we see come up on a regular basis in cases that involve workplace harassment issues. So that's a little bit about my practice. As I mentioned, I've done a lot of training over the years, and we'll talk about this further into the presentation, but most workplace harassment training tends to focus on liability prevention, and it complies with the requirements of AB 1825 and 1661, which have mandated this training. But what it hasn't done is really sort of talk about what organizations can do to address their internal cultures and the types of preventative measures that can be put in place and the kinds of discussions that can and should be had about workplace harassment issues before they turn into litigation. So I am really excited to partner up today with my colleague, Lauren Croft. Lauren Croft is also an attorney in our Labor and Employment Group, and she really brings a fresh perspective to some of these issues, so I'm really excited to hear from her today as well. Lauren, why don't you tell the group a little bit about your practice?
Hi, everyone. To echo Tracy, very excited to be here and to be engaging in discussions like this, and specifically today to take that deeper dive that goes beyond our check, next trainings that have gone on since about 2005. A little bit about me: I am an associate at Burke Williams & Sorensen, focusing on litigation, some advice and counsel work, and also have a focus on communications and media and how media strategies and communication and messaging can and should help and assist organizations, and how also, common pitfalls to avoid. And so very excited to be here and get started.
Okay, and for those of you participating in the webinar, it looks like there is a Q&A box. I haven't tried it here on our end as the presenter, but I think you have the ability to type in a question. We can see your questions on our end when they pop up, so if there's something that we're talking about that you want us to spend a little bit more time on, or you see some content on a slide because we may not cover every point on the slide, but you want us to talk more about that, feel free to chime in with your questions. Anything that comes to mind, we can see those questions here on our end, and we will be happy to take them as we go through the material. So with that, I wanted to just sort of set the context for what we're going to be talking about today. For at least the last 20 years, women have been complaining about workplace harassment all the way from Anita Hill, which was perhaps one of the first times we as a country really shined a spotlight on this issue, up until the Me Too movement kind of got off the ground running last year. According to the EEOC, there were almost 85,000 charges of harassment, discrimination, and retaliation filed with that agency in 2017. Those same statistics reveal that about 70% of women do not actually report sexual harassment. So what we can glean from that is that this is a problem that is actually even more widespread than what we're seeing in the data. Interesting that for the last 20 years, women have been complaining about workplace harassment and men have been denying it. All the way back from Bill Clinton up to some of the folks that have more recently been in the headlines, including Roy Moore and Donald Trump. And I guess it goes to, they deny it, I think, unless they happen to be on a hot mic. So it depends who it is exactly we're talking about. But sort of the differences in perceptions and approaches to these issues, with women being victims of this kind of behavior and having a platform and not necessarily being believed, and for a pretty consistent pattern of men not acknowledging that kind of behavior, and really kind of a wholesale failure of employers in a lot of different industries to confront that disparity head on and to really take efforts to address it. One study that we looked at last fall that was put out by ABC News and the Washington Post confirmed that about 3/4 of Americans believe that harassment is a problem in the workplace. One of the things that really struck me last fall was that a group of more than 150 women in politics here in California submitted a letter indicating that they had all been subjected to workplace harassment. There is virtually no industry here in California that has escaped these kinds of allegations, whether it's tech, higher education, entertainment, the government. The allegations are absolutely just widespread and far-reaching. If we could move on to the next slide. And we'll move on past that one. We've already introduced ourselves. You know who we are. So what are we going to be talking about today with that introduction? First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the Me Too movement and how we arrived where we are today and why we're having this discussion. Then we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about promoting a culture that values equality and diversity. Then we're going to talk about effective leadership from city officials and managers, what you can do personally to have an impact on your organization. Then we'll talk a little bit about some practical measures that could be implemented to help prevent these claims from arising in the first place. And then we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the more common issues that we deal with when addressing workplace harassment issues. And those include trying to decide what are the appropriate interim measures that we need to take, how do we respond to allegations of harassment, what are the parameters of conducting an appropriate investigation, and then finally we'll wrap up with a short segment on media strategies and crisis management. So we'll move on. So I'm going to turn this over to Lauren for a few minutes, and she's going to talk about the diagnosis of this disaster. Exactly how did we end up here and the Me Too movement? So with that, Lauren, why don't you take it away for a few minutes?
Great. So moving on to the next slide. Unless you've been living under a rock, which I don't think you have, you've heard the hashtag #MeToo. You've seen it on your social media, in newspapers, in articles. People have probably talked about it at social gatherings. And the #MeToo hashtag was tweeted out by an actress, Alyssa Milano, on October 15th, 2017. And the hashtag, going back, we're still there, thank you. The hashtag was an overnight phenomenon. It was retweeted nearly 1 million times within 48 hours. Almost half of Facebook users had somebody who posted a Me Too story. And Me Too was basically an anthem explaining, claiming, and identifying with somebody who had been sexually harassed or assaulted or raped or abused in some way. But the Me Too movement actually started in about a decade prior by someone named Tarana Burke, who's still very much involved with the movement. And it started as a movement for women in poverty at the Girls for Gender Equity Center in Brooklyn. And Tarana Burke talks about the hashtag and really the movement and what it meant. And one quote that she said is that it's two-sided. It's the bold declarative statement that I'm not ashamed and I'm not alone. And on the other side, it's the statement from survivor to survivor saying, I see you and I hear you. So even though this hashtag has become really, quote unquote, media sexy, what the initial and, what the root of the hashtag is acknowledging that this problem of sexual violence in the world and in the U.S. is pervasive and real, and moving forward from that and hopefully allowing for some productive steps to change this in the future.
Lauren, how, in your opinion, has the advent of social media as a platform for communicating about these issues changed our dialogue and our understanding of it?
I think that's a really good question. And with one of the main issues that we might touch on later, but is important to touch on now, is the fact that, like I said, about 10 years ago, the Me Too movement started, but we didn't have the social media platform that we have now at our fingertips. And what social media has allowed us to see is that communities are everywhere, and that so many women and people have experienced sexual violence that it's hard to ignore at this point. And I think that proof was a real issue in the decades prior. I know you mentioned Anita Hill and that surge of people recognizing and identifying with social violence. But now we have the undeniable proof that this happens. People can, endorse or acknowledge or help justify someone else's story, and so people don't feel as alone, so they're more comfortable with moving forward.
So this isn't just another social media fad, right? This hashtag is here to stay, and this has had profound consequences on the organizations that we work with, hasn't it?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's move on.
So, and just like Tracy said, this is definitely not a fad. The Me Too movement was then followed up by the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, which was started by over 1,000 women in the entertainment industry. And this fund is, the goal was to raise $22 million to be able to support women and all victims of sexual violence to bring forth allegations. As of today, this defense fund has raised $21,735,000 with almost 21,000 unique donations.
Wow. So that many unique donations, as well as some huge donations from some pretty high-profile celebrities, right?
Yes, absolutely. Some including, $2 million from the Spielberg Foundation, $1.5 million from Mark Wahlberg, $1 million from J.J. Abrams. That's just to name a couple of them.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So let's move on.
So there's been a lot of research done about trying to understand this problem and its pervasiveness in the workplace specifically. And this Pew Research study done in April has come forth with some interesting statistics. 59% of women and 25% of men say that they've received unwanted sexual advances, verbally or physically, in the workplace. And these are just people who are responding. I know that earlier we touched on the fact that about 70% of harassment allegations aren't reported.
Yeah.
Interestingly, 51% of Americans believe that the increased focus on sexual harassment has actually made it more difficult to solve this problem, which is...
Well, that statistic's always been a bit of a head-scratcher for me. About half of Americans don't know how to interact with women in the workplace.
Right.
What's the disconnect there? Interact with a woman the same way you would interact with anyone else. It doesn't keep sex out of the workplace. It seems pretty straightforward to me. But that one's always been a head-scratcher to me.
Exactly. And there are a couple other head-scratchers, too. This one is about 50% of Americans consider that men getting away with sexual harassment is a major problem. 35 say it's a minor problem. Not sure what the other 15% are thinking.
Well, at least 85% agree it's a problem.
Exactly. So that's good. But here's one that, 31% of Americans consider false claims to be a major problem for women coming forward with false claims in the workplace. 45% say it's a minor problem. That is a lot of people.
So that's really interesting to me that there are so many people that acknowledge that it's a problem and it's an actual thing, and yet so many people also share a concern that these allegations are being made falsely, when in fact the data shows that's not true, right?
Exactly. Data shows that false allegations, which are allegations made up out of thin air, are the same percentage as false allegations in every other crime, which is about 2 to 6%, closer to 2%. So when people are, 76% of Americans are thinking this is a problem, but only 2% of all cases are actually fabricated, which is exactly the same.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. I think it may be more common and maybe the basis for this perception is the fact that sometimes a complaint may be made and it turns out the person making the complaint is wrong, that maybe the behavior doesn't rise to the legally actionable level of sexual harassment. It doesn't mean that they're lying about it, or maybe there wasn't sufficient evidence in an investigation to substantiate the allegation, but that doesn't mean that it's not true.
Exactly.
So I don't know what the solution is to bridge that discrepancy between people thinking it's a problem and people thinking it's made up, but clearly we have some work to do.
Exactly.
All right, so let's move on.
So I'm not going to spend too long on this. I think we've all seen and heard of the allegations in government. I know that in this particular group, it's incredibly important, but allegations have been seen at every level of government, whether it's local, county, state, nationally, and I know that earlier Kristen was talking about a couple of people stepping down for most recent allegations, and it's a pervasive issue. To date, 27 women have accused our president of sexual misconduct, and that's just one example.
Every time you turn on the TV or open a newspaper, do people still open newspapers? or click into the internet, there's another story. You just can't seem to escape it. So let's move on.
Okay. So I think you touched on this earlier. The power of social media is the power of exposure and recognition. And it was harder for people to see and believe that seemingly normal people could engage in such violent and egregious conduct. But showing that and exposing that is what's allowing us to kind of be desensitized to the fact that, yes, this is an issue, and aggressors unfortunately come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, they sure do. So let's move on to talk a little bit about gender bias and objectification in the workplace.
So additionally, in addition to the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace is gender bias, and that's where a lot of this can get started. And we'll talk about objectification in just a second, but
sort of the stereotyping of women, right?
Exactly. Social science experiments have proved time and time again that there is a pervasive gender bias in the workplace. And one that I'll just touch on really quick is from Columbia Business School. A professor gave to his class 2 identical resumes. One of Heidi Rosen, a successful venture capitalist, a real person, and one just changed the name to Howard, same exact font and resume. And while people thought that Heidi came off as maybe selfish, they didn't think that they would hire her in a venture capitalist situation, people saw Howard as authoritative and assertive. And so we know that this is real.
Yeah.
And even though it might take a while to dissipate, at least acknowledging that and trying to catch ourselves, women and men, because we can all be gender biased,
sure,
is the first huge step.
All right. So let's talk about objectifying in the workplace a little bit and move on.
Yeah, objectification on the next slide is another issue that I think kind of gets lost. I always talk about this. I was talking with my grandfather about what's going on in the workplace and explaining to him that women are being objectified, and he said, "Well, aren't these compliments? Someone saying that someone has nice legs, or that someone looks pretty, or that someone talking at the water cooler about other people." And I said, well, they're objectifying these people, and these women have to come into work every single day and to be seen as an object instead of as an employee, to be looked at instead of listened to. It's an issue that has happened for years. And it's getting better, but it's still here.
And I think that this is one of the areas where employees kind of struggle with what are the appropriate boundaries. you know, we all want to work in an environment that's collegial, that's fun, where some appropriate banter is an okay thing to engage in. You know, and when I do workplace harassment training for staff members, you know, I tell them these rules aren't here to say that you can't give somebody a compliment or to give an appropriate handshake or pat on the back, depending on the circumstances and who's involved. But there is a big difference between, hey, you look nice today, or you got a haircut, that looks good on you, and, you know, those comments that we hear from time to time. So I think there's a lot of work to be done within many organizations that kind of establish that boundary training and really helping people understand when and at what point their behavior crosses the line from friendly to creepy.
Totally. And I think in addition to those obviously creepy, like, looking good, you know, we can hear that, but also is the pervasiveness and the repetition. So if someone's coming into work every day and someone's saying, hey, you look great, nice dress, nice shoes, and every day that's all they're hearing, it does become creepy, even though taken out of context one time, that would be no problem whatsoever.
And what's interesting, too, right, is that legally the analysis doesn't focus on the intent of the harasser, right? You're looking at the impact on the victim or the person who is subjected to that kind of behavior. So really starting to make people more aware of the impact their behavior causes on someone else could be an effective training tool. We can go out and tell people, look, you could be personally sued and held liable for this, but that doesn't necessarily translate. What we need to do is get people thinking about how their own behavior affects the culture within the workplace.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on.
And I think that this new narrative, and like you said, having people start to think about their behavior changing is far more powerful than we even realize. And I've talked about this a couple of times, but our brain can help us change the way that we see everything. One example I always use is if you are looking to get a new car and all of a sudden you start seeing Toyota Highlanders everywhere because that's what you were looking at, that's your brain telling you, oh, I'm going to change the way that I see the world and I'm going to focus on Toyota Highlanders. Well, Toyota Highlanders are all well and good, but what would be far more powerful is if we started to recognize, I'm going to change the way that I see and digest people interacting with each other, and I'm going to notice, am I saying something that's appropriate? Is somebody else saying something? And try to really lean into that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy. Okay, well, let's move on to a brief discussion on promoting a culture that values equality and diversity, because I think putting a premium on those things, equality and diversity, will go a long way to confronting the workplace harassment and Me Too problem that we're seeing currently.
I completely agree with that. So moving on to the next slide. There are some interesting things that are being done to help promote this equality and diversity in the workplace. It starts with recruiting. You know, a lot of job descriptions actually use biased language, and so even from the second that you put out a job description on ZipRecruiter or on LinkedIn, the language that's used can often dictate who's applying or who feels comfortable applying. Now, 64% of companies are ensuring that the language is not biased. And it moves on. It moves on to retention. Right now I'm pulling from a study that was done with LeanIn.org and McKinsey & Company. And 70% of companies track representation in hiring. So they want to keep track of and make sure that they're diversifying their employee workforce. Having said that, only 25% set gender targets. So I think that's probably going to be the next step is we're looking at what we're doing, but we're actually taking active steps to make sure that we're our workforce represents our community.
And achieving the goals that we're trying to set here. Wow, that's really interesting.
Exactly. And then this one is fascinating, which is representation. Something that I know we'll touch on throughout is the fact that diversity needs to go from the bottom to the top, and it benefits companies more when diverse viewpoints and backgrounds can infiltrate every area of a business or an organization or an agency. Interestingly, this study showed that 50% of men think that women are well represented in companies when 10% of senior leaders are women.
So more of that disconnect.
More of that disconnect. And I think we're all really wanting to move forward in the right direction, but when asked to think, well, what does your boardroom look like? Oh, it's fine, 9 men, one woman, that's okay. I think that's where the shift is going to move to now.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about why diversity matters, and particularly why it matters in a public sector workplace.
Absolutely. Public sector specifically, the job is to serve your community. And if who's working inside an agency doesn't reflect what's going on outside of an agency, then the agency, it increases the likelihood of the agency being out of touch with its constituents. That happens obviously in the private sector as well, but I think you're right, it's even more important in the public sector. We can actually move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what the power of diversity brings. It's actually been studied that racially diverse companies, agencies, and organizations outperform non-diverse ones by 35%. And that was shown in several studies, but specifically in one MIT research study. It found the reasons why diverse groups are so much more successful than non-diverse groups. And 3 key points were, 1, everyone having equal time to talk and share their viewpoint, which seems really simple, but actually can be overlooked a lot. 2, there was a sensitivity towards one another. So people were willing to give someone the benefit of the doubt in a group that was really diverse. Whereas if it was maybe, 9 people of the exact same gender and ethnic background and 1 other person, their ideas might not have been taken as well. But when it was a really diverse group, it was taken better. And then including women, was a huge factor in productivity. Really quick, Tina Fey actually did an interview where she was talking about the writer's room in Saturday Night Live. And she was saying that, she would write jokes all the time that just would go over the writer's room head. And she was like, these are funny jokes. What she came to realize is the writer's room was predominantly male.
Yeah.
And so when she would, throw out these joke ideas, even though it would probably resonate with half of the population, it wasn't getting pushed forward. That idea, that's one example, but that idea is something we see in all sorts of rooms and strategy sessions.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's really interesting and ties really well back into the point that you were making about wanting our local government workforces to mirror the communities they serve.
Exactly.
Based on the view that I have on my computer, I'm not able to see questions, but I think if I were to ask the group now, how many of you are strategically working with business partners in your city based on diversity goals and their representation? I imagine many of you would put your hands up. And so I think that taking that concept that we're going to strategically partner with women and minority-owned businesses in our communities and those types of community organizations, and then translating that into our own workforces could go a long way. All right, so with that, let's move on to the next slide and briefly talk about tokenism.
It's Annie.
Hey, Annie.
We do have a couple of questions. One is, what is an example of bias language in a recruitment brochure?
Okay.
No name.
And then were there other, you want to name a couple of the questions?
Any others?
And then Sandra has her hand raised.
Sorry, there was a hand raised and the question was?
Sandra, if you could type in your question in the box, that would be great. So I think that's it for now. I'll wait to hear from Sandra on the question. So I know you can't see the Q&A box.
I can't. So thank you for sharing that, and members of the audience, thank you for bearing with us as we're working through our super helpful league staff to work on the PowerPoint today. So to get to the answer about biased language in recruiting materials, it can be very subtle in some cases. It can be overt in other cases. Sometimes the way, for example, the hours are established or lack of flexibility in scheduling can inadvertently bias the position against women.
Absolutely.
Some other examples?
So something that would, immediately shift to the mindset that someone would be hiring a woman, and that doesn't mean that they would want to hire a woman, but that's what's in their head. For example, for a teacher, they often talk about a supportive and caring employee, and those are great qualities, but those aren't often qualities that we associate with professional men in the workplace. So that might dissuade someone because of what they've been told it means to be a professional in the workplace. On the other side, I think things like assertive, things like aggressive,
strong leader.
Exactly. A lot of it's really what we are and we aren't identifying with for gender stereotypes. So whether it dissuades someone, whether somebody feels I might not be qualified, or whether somebody feels they are, but then when, let's say, somebody is a quote-unquote strong, aggressive female comes into an interview, and in fact, that's not necessarily the person that the hiring force was looking for, because what they were thinking of aggressive was their masculine version of what that meant.
Right.
So those are just a couple examples.
So those are a couple of examples. Yeah, and if I'm not sure who it was that asked the question because I can't see the box, but if you want to contact me and Lauren after the presentation, we're happier to talk a little bit more about some of that biased language and ways that bias can creep into the recruitment process. Annie, thank you for bringing those questions to our attention. If you want to go ahead and just chime in and let us know when there's a question, we'll be happy to take a break and answer that question. So with that, let's very briefly get back to tokenism.
Okay, great. So we've been talking about the importance of diversity, but what's equally important is to avoid tokenism. And tokenism, we have the definition right here. It's the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of underrepresented groups for your workforce. And that's kind of where we were talking about having diversity from top to bottom. Tokenism is that key example of we're going to take the one South Asian female who happens to be in an intern in marketing, and we're going to put her in a photo with all the VPs just to make sure that we show everybody that she's a part of our workforce. And making sure that we avoid that and that we're really making an effort to have genuine and authentic diversity and inclusion and belonging is really important, because that's what's going to derive results. You won't get results from tokenism.
And I will say, in my experience as a litigator who works on race discrimination, gender discrimination, and harassment type lawsuits, oftentimes when you have a sole individual who fits into one particular category or another, feeling like a token in a workplace is often very isolating, and not uncommonly will lead to a claim of harassment or discrimination based on that sense of tokenism and isolation.
Or at the very least, it will decrease retention.
Sure. All right, so let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion and the kinds of things that employers are doing to incorporate that idea into their workplace.
So these statistics show, and it's what's seen, is that about half of employers are focusing on diversity in leadership, on diversity in a mission statement and in company, organization, or agency values, and in things like mentorship programs. About 67% of employers want to foster an environment of respect of differing opinions, which is really important. But if we move on to the next slide, it'll touch on the fact that having a diverse workforce and acknowledging that that's a problem is the first step, but really listening to, taking into consideration, and trying to increase those levels, that's what's going to actually change the workforce and change the culture.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide.
And something that we take for granted is the fact that the way that we work and live has drastically changed with technology and with our expectations of what it means to be an employee somewhere, especially in public agencies. This can be a big part of somebody's identity. And because people take their work home with them, because people are, networking about their jobs, because people are checking their emails first thing in bed, feeling like you're belonging in your work environment is becoming more important, and it's becoming kind of a make or break for employee retention.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next segment of the presentation, which is what local officials and managers can do to start bringing these changes about within their organization. So on the next slide, I think is really kind of the primary point that we want to hit home, and I think that this is maybe, if we can move on to the next slide, the most important message that I want folks to take away with them today, and that's the concept that change starts here. It starts at the top. It starts with leadership. For those of you who are joining us who are elected officials, not only do you represent your constituents in your community, but you establish a leadership role within the cities and the communities that you serve. Certainly our city managers and other high-ranking managers and supervisors within the organization play that role. And I think if our leadership is willing to take a long, hard look at addressing implicit biases and addressing true diversity in the workplace and putting a premium and a focus on bringing different points of views and candid conversations about those issues to the table, that message is going to trickle down.
Absolutely.
If you encourage it, no. If you demand that of your employees and your staff, and you can get their buy-in, and we'll talk about how to do that in a few minutes, I really think that we have the ability and the opportunity to make great changes. Not only does it make the workplace better, but it's a great tool that can be used as well on the legal liability prevention side.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to the next slide. And Lauren, why don't you talk a little bit about how we choose to observe and acknowledge the things that are going on in our workplace and how historically ignoring those kinds of things has become a problem?
Absolutely. So it really is that simple. Sometimes just engaging your senses and keeping your eyes and ears open to what doesn't feel right or look right or sound right can make a huge difference. And I'm going to bring up an example that I think some of you may have heard in the news about Starbucks. On April 12th of this year in Philadelphia, a woman who was working at a Starbucks demanded that two African-American men order something or leave. They were waiting for a friend. They said they were going to order something. And when they didn't leave, she called the police. And they were removed. What would have happened maybe if a coworker of hers said, hey, you know, do we really want to call the police? These people aren't necessarily doing anything. You know, we've all waited for friends at Starbucks before. I just wonder what would happen.
I've sat in Starbucks and just used their Wi-Fi without ordering anything on many occasions.
And you know, the tone from the top and their response was exactly that.
Yeah.
Starbucks said, Our place is a meeting place between work and home. Anyone can be here at any time. And their change, and I think the mayor of Philadelphia, Jim Kenney, he made a statement that says this appears to exemplify what racial discrimination looks like, remember our senses, in 2018. Acknowledging this issue, engaging with the fact that we need to be open to eyes and ears and looking out for discrimination to stop it is truly the first step.
Yeah. And I think that very swift and public response is the trend that I at least hope we're going to continue to see. I mean, if you just look what happened with the canceling of the Roseanne show a couple of days ago. Again, sending the message that we're not going to tolerate that kind of language, that kind of behavior, that type of exclusive conduct within our organization.
And just to really quickly, Starbucks has done a great job. I hope that they continue their conversation, but on Tuesday they closed 8,000 stores and did training for 175,000 employees for anti-bias. And so they're really putting their money where their mouth is, not only to obviously deliver the training, but also the money that they lost by closing it. They recognize the importance of attacking the the discrimination. The hope is that the conversation continues, because one day is not going to fix the problem.
Sure.
It sure is a really good
start. It's a good step in the right direction. Okay, so let's move on to the next point, which I think really ties into this, and that's bystanders. And this is a really sort of an emerging conversation that we're starting to see in more workplaces, but that's the empowerment of other employees who may observe this kind of behavior going on. So, Lauren, why don't you say just a couple words about that?
Exactly. Active bystanders are our first line of defense, because when you see something that might not rise to the level of, liability, which is great, but might cross a line of appropriateness, not doing anything about it is just going to let the problem boil. Empowering our workforce to call out the behavior, interrupt the action. There are a lot of different methods. Some are humor, some are taking a stance, some are reaching out to the person who the conduct's been directed at. Giving your workforce tools to know what to do in these situations is really a great form of prevention, and it's something we are seeing. And there are trainings for that. There's programming that you can put on for your employees so that they know, a couple different ways that they can handle a situation if they see it.
Right, which I think translates really well onto our next slide, which is the concept of leaning in instead of leaning out. What does that mean?
Exactly. I think this quote is pretty poignant, so I am going to read it. It says, "My research over the past couple of years showed that men were hesitant to have one-on-one meetings, go out to lunch, or go on business trips alone with a woman, and now it's gotten worse." I'm not going to read any more of that, but this operation out of fear instead of empowerment has to change.
Is that backlash to the Me Too movement that we're seeing?
Exactly. It is backlash, and what it's doing is further dividing women from men. It's continuing this disadvantage that has gone on for decades. And so operating out of empowerment and saying, I'm going to learn and feel comfortable with how to handle a situation instead of just shy away from it and not be a mentor to a bright young female worker and not, have a one-on-one meeting. Instead of giving yourselves the tools to be able to lean into that is going to be highly beneficial for everyone involved.
And I think that's where and we'll talk about this in a little bit more in a few minutes, but really updating the way we're training employees and having those conversations about appropriate boundaries and how to interact with each other appropriately in the workplace, regardless of gender, can really have a big impact.
And it just makes people feel more comfortable with what they're doing. They feel like they know how to interact, even if it's repeating things that seem like common sense. Sometimes just having it confirm that it is common sense is really helpful.
Right. So with that, let's move on to the next slide and kind of round out this segment back to the original concept of what leaders can do. So again, the statement from the top, walking the walk and leading by example, really truly are the best way to send the message to the entire organization that these are the standards that we're going to adhere to. So what are some things that leaders can do within an organization to send that message? What are some practical things they can do?
Absolutely. First is looking at your mission statement, making sure that it includes that, having a public address about these issues, having a town hall or roundtable about them, and also making sure that your policies and procedures are in line with this idea of diversity, inclusion, a zero tolerance policy against harassment, an open door policy against encouraging questions and concerns, and really making it a comfortable environment for your workforce to give you an honest layout of what it feels like to be an employee.
Okay, and then I think the final point there, are you going to put your money where your mouth is?
Yeah.
Are you going to allocate the time and the funds to doing the training and doing the work that needs to be done to get your workforce where it should be? It's the Starbucks effect.
I was going to say, are you going to be a Starbucks? Because you should. It is. It's putting your money where your mouth is.
All right, so on to the next slide, I think also kind of ties into this discussion, but that's this whole carrot and the stick concept.
Yes.
Are you holding people within your organization accountable for conduct that violates our civility guidelines, our workplace harassment policies, our courteous treatment of others standards, and are you rewarding people for behavior that does comply with those standards? like I said earlier, I can't currently see hands being raised, but if I were to pose the question to the group, how many of you have actually held a supervisor accountable for failing to report harassment or failing to appropriately intervene in a situation when it came up? I bet a couple of hands would go up, but that's something that we don't really see very often. And it happens all the time.
Absolutely.
The supervisor knows about a problem, they've seen something, they've heard something, they were personally there when it happened and maybe rolled their eyes and didn't think it was a big deal. Instead of doing the right thing, which was to, one, intervene,
yes,
and to, kind of utilize that bystander role that they have, and then to go to human resources, report it, and make sure it gets resolved.
And often people don't feel comfortable because they think, oh, well, it wasn't that bad, or I'm not sure.
The joke was funny.
Yeah,
I don't think he meant to offend anyone by it.
So then you're overlooking all of these baseline indicators that there's a problem going on.
Right.
So I think you're right. It's rewarding supervisors and managers taking action and being involved in this process.
So let's move on to the next slide and talk about some practices that our cities and other public entities can do to help update their practices in a way that focuses on accountability.
Here we are. All right. So I think one is definitely getting to know and understand the problem. Do you have evaluations? Do they give employees an opportunity to accurately review their supervisors so that you can manage down and they can feel empowered to manage up? The other thing is, are there systems in place for people who maybe don't feel comfortable coming forward? Is there an anonymous hotline? Are there office hours for the city manager or for some other leader to take a less formal route to address a complaint or a concern or something of that nature?
Yeah, and one thing I've certainly noticed in my years of practice is that oftentimes supervisors become a supervisor because they were promoted because they have the underlying skill set that makes them good at their job. They haven't necessarily been promoted because they're good or effective at managing people, and that's not necessarily a skill that they've ever had any training in. So perhaps one thing that could be done, and we may have this content on another slide, but since we're chatting about it now, really providing those training opportunities to supervisors and empowering them to know how to manage their staff, to have a basic understanding of what's required and expected of them as supervisors, how their conduct, their actions, their failure to take actions that they should take can not only impact the cultural norms within an organization, but can create liability as well. So really starting to focus on that aspect and trickle that message and those values down through proper training to managers, I think is really important as well.
And also rewarding good management skills, rewarding managers for taking an extra step, even if it's not necessarily successful or if it doesn't result in a major change, to give your managers positive reinforcement to be leaders is just as important, and they are both equally important, as really disciplining a manager who's not doing that.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to the next segment of our presentation, and that is a discussion about some practical things that we can do to prevent harassment from happening. Now, we all know that, training is an important component of that. Having a written workplace harassment policy is a practical component of that. But let's do a little bit of a deeper dive on some examples of things that other government entities are doing that we think are unique and interesting, and some other tips and ideas for our members on the line. So first of all, let's move on to the next slide and kind of talk a little bit about, again, this concept of leading for change.
Absolutely. Well, we're seeing it on a statewide level and on a local level that all government agencies are seeing this as a problem. Some are moving forward faster than others on, really putting actionable items forward to help address these issues. If we move on to the next slide, we can look at what a couple of states have done. In Louisiana, Governor Edwards launched a sexual harassment task force. And what's good about that is that it kind of takes a real deep infiltration into what particular problems are pervasive to that government agency specifically, because each agency is made up of a different group of people, different leaders, and a different history. So task force can be really helpful with that. Were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
In Oklahoma, they upped their training for state agencies and have made training available to all agencies, which is really important. I think we're going to hone in on training a lot, because that's what gives managers the tools and the ability to take what they've learned and actually feel confident doing it or acting it.
And we've seen a little bit of that here in California in the last couple of years with the adoption of AB 1661, which now requires the state-mandated harassment training for most of our local agency officials. We have yet to see that be applied to other levels of government or agencies, but I think that in light of the staying power of the Me Too movement, we in California will lead the trend on that.
I do too. Just to touch on Vermont, they are requiring all state employees, 8,000 of them, to undergo training by the end of this year. And I think you're right. I don't think California will be far behind.
Agreed.
On the management level and on the employee level.
So let's take a look at the next slide and what some other cities around the country are doing to address the Me Too movement and the issue of workplace harassment.
So interestingly, in New York City, a bill or a package of bills, 11 bills passed, called the Stop Sexual Harassment Act. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but one feature of it, going back to the idea of the importance of training, is that training is now going to be mandated, sexual harassment prevention training twice per year.
Not just biennially like we do here in California.
Exactly.
Well, it's one of those things where when you're only training people every other year for a couple of hours, the reality is when I have a room full of people that I'm training, 5 minutes after I dismiss the group, they will have forgotten 50% of what I said. 5 months later, they will have forgotten 75% of it. A year later, they will not remember that they ever even attended the session.
Exactly.
So making the training more repeated, more robust, more often, and expanding the coverage, I think, is going to go a long way.
It also allows for the people conducting the training to take deeper dives, because there are tons of things we always talk about that we would love to cover in a training, but we just don't have the time. We have to cover certain things every other year in a 2-hour time slot. But if you're really given opportunities to train multiple times a year, you can make it a lot more relevant, industry-specific, bring in different, news and media trends going on, and cover the issue from all angles instead of just kind of having that, for lack of a better word, boring, check the box
click,
training.
Next training. Yeah. And I'll just briefly talk about what's going on here in the city of Los Angeles. Our illustrious Mayor Eric Garcetti has launched a new policy that requires departments to report workplace harassment issues within 48 hours of learning about the allegation. This is something that should be happening anyway. We shouldn't have to have a written policy that directs supervisors to do that. They should be sufficiently trained that they know their obligation is to immediately report it. I certainly make myself clear when I'm training managers that no allegation of harassment should sit in their inbox unresponded to for any length of time. So not terribly surprised by that development, but again, another strategy that some cities may want to use. Update the policies to take the mandated reporting requirement a step further and give it a hard timeline, and then start holding people accountable when they don't comply with it.
Exactly.
So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about what cities and other public entities can do to take a good hard look at their organization from the inside to evaluate whether they have a problem and what things they can do to address it.
Absolutely. I think institutional knowledge of your issues is really important because every agency is a different size, has a different history, has different dynamics with elected officials, management, the way that committees are set up, the way that employee teams are set up. And so really understanding your particular workforce can help you further understand where weaknesses might lie and what areas to focus your energy in.
And so one of the things that we've been talking about doing to help you understand your internal problems, if you have any, is the idea of climate surveys, which is on the next slide. We're starting to see more and more organizations. Let's move on to the next slide. We were starting to see more organizations incorporating climate surveys into their internal assessments of their workplace culture. A climate survey is a tool that an employer can use to kind of get their finger on the pulse of what the current issues are. Now, of course, there's other opportunities to have those discussions. For our cities on the line where you work with the unionized workforce, you know that during labor negotiations there are opportunities to have your finger on the pulse about what the sticking points are. But these climate surveys go even further than that. A lot of times employers will wait until an employee is separating and then have them do some kind of an exit interview or an exit questionnaire. And if the employee is leaving and maybe disgruntled about something, you're likely to hear about it in that forum. But if you had asked sooner, you may have been able to retain a valuable employee. You may have been able to detect an employee with a brewing complaint or allegation that could have and should have been addressed and resolved earlier. So why don't you explain a little bit about what a climate survey is and what kind of information that can get at?
Absolutely. Climate surveys, and just to quickly touch on another reason why they're so effective, and I'll explain a little bit about the questions and what they look like in a minute. They're effective because it gives an employee an opportunity to be honest in a way that you will not get from a manager or a boss walking up to a lower level employee saying, "Are you happy here? What's going on? Are you sexually harassed? Is anything going on?" I have actually had, friends, colleagues, or heard stories where a boss asks an employee, "Have you ever been sexually harassed here?"
Yeah.
My guess is that nobody is going to say yes to that answer.
Right.
If they are, they're more power to them. But what these climate surveys do is broach issues instead of particular questions. I pulled up a climate survey from the County of Santa Barbara, and
they ask a lot of questions in their survey about ethics, the environment generally. Are there a couple of those that you think are particularly insightful questions?
Yes, there's about 55 questions that broach those topics, and what they do is ask, here's one. To what extent do you feel isolated in the workplace? Then it gives you a 1 to 10. Not isolated is 1, and 10 is fully isolated. Or to what extent do you receive quality feedback on your performance? To what extent does your department connect employees' work to the broader goals of the county, et cetera? So asking to what extent these issues are makes it not a black or white issue,
right,
but a real scale,
right,
which is important because if you're asked a black or white question, some things might fall into the no category that really are a maybe or almost. And so having this, it really is a storm detector, which is what we have up there, because you can see what problems are brewing, what's been overlooked for far too long, and what's kind of in between.
And it really gives an employer the opportunity to address a potentially brewing issue based on the feedback in the climate survey that they might not otherwise hear about until some process server shows up with a copy of a lawsuit.
Exactly. And then a manager or supervisor can go up to an employee and say, this climate survey says that people are feeling a little bit isolated here. Have you ever felt that way? Would you feel comfortable talking to me about that? And approaching the issue that way, if you want to follow up from a climate survey, is going to breed far more honest conversation than just asking someone completely out of the blue how they feel about these issues.
Are we getting adequate communication and direction from our supervisor? If your climate survey tells you no, well, how do we deal with that? Well, maybe we need to have, a weekly tailgate meeting. It doesn't have to be long, 10 or 15 minutes between supervisors and staff, just to check in, update who's working on what, acknowledge an employee's accomplishment, in the prior whatever time has passed since the last meeting. There's lots of things that can be done rather than having employees continue to feel isolated, continue to feel that they're not getting the communication and direction that they need. So really great tool. But with that, let's move on and talk again about training in a little bit more detail. So as many of you know, because you've already been to this training, since 2005, workplace harassment training has been mandated for managers and supervisors on a biennial basis. What that means is that your organization should have had by now at least 7 of those trainings for all of your managers and supervisors. Well, what has the impact of that training been? I'm sure some of you on the phone today have actually had me come out and do your training, because I do a lot of it here around the state of California. And if you've had me as your trainer, then you will have heard me say, I can come out and teach workplace harassment training until I am blue in the face, but I can't fix stupid. And no, I've done hundreds and hundreds of harassment training sessions, and yet my desk is full of workplace harassment lawsuits.
Absolutely.
So, we go out there and we talk about it. We hit all of the points that the law says we have to hit in the 2 hours that we're allotted to talk about it once every other year. Yeah. But you're going to lose some impact. So what are the things that have been a problem with that training on the next slide? We know that 2 hours is not sufficient. We also know that there has been a real lack of emphasis on some other important topics, whether that's implicit bias, diversity and inclusion, civility guidelines, empowering bystanders, and then I will say, as an employment litigator, what I think is maybe most important are supervisory best practices, right? Your managers and supervisors are your frontline defense when it comes to managing employee issues. And if they're asleep at the wheel and not paying attention to the conduct between the employees, or they're the one yucking it up or telling the jokes or ratifying the behavior and they're part of the problem, they're not engaging in best practices. And I think that really taking the time and the money and the opportunities to adequately train them about their obligations as managers and supervisors, and to get that leadership message from the top down through them, is going to be a really important additional component of preventing this.
Also, oftentimes with training, we're doing a lot of the talking because we have to get a lot of information out in a very short amount of time. But having real conversations with supervisors about best practices, answering their questions, allowing them to feel like they know what to do and how to handle a specific situation can make a really big difference.
So in addition to the types of trainings that we put up on the slide, effective documentation for managers and supervisors, understanding their legal obligations when it comes to disabled employees in the interactive process, maybe a boot camp on California employment law for supervisors, because they play such a critical role in all the areas of employee management and employee issues. Really kind of giving them that broad training is the way to make it better. Just these 2 hours every couple of years about the specific topic of workplace harassment isn't enough. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have a couple of ideas for what can be done to make training better. Well, we've obviously got to do more of it, more frequently. I am a big believer in live workplace training. A webinar can be a great tool. I do have some organizations that I work with that use that online pre-recorded training. It's click, click, next stuff. Nobody's paying attention to it. They may have the training presentation up on one of their monitors, but I guarantee you they're watching cat videos on YouTube on the other screen and not retaining it.
And they're probably responding to text messages and scrolling on their phone too. And we're all less interactive when we're sitting in front of 6 screens than when we're sitting in front of other people.
And the other thing is training staff. Now, of course, California AB 1825 training is only mandated for managers and supervisors and now most of our local agency officials. But those rules and those policies that we spend all of this time making for our workplaces are only as effective as the employees who know what's in them. So also taking the time to adequately train employees is going to go a long way to promoting that culture that focuses on prevention of these claims.
And,
go ahead.
And that can also help with what we've talked about, where people are being promoted with no leadership experience whatsoever. If at the very least employees are being trained and being treated like a supervisor in this capacity, then when they do eventually get promoted, they might have a different viewpoint or have seen the issues from a different standard because they have that education and that baseline.
Absolutely. So on the next slide, you'll see there are a lot of other important benefits. Whoops, sorry, I skipped ahead a slide here. So what are some things that we can, let's go one more forward.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. That one's good. We'll stop there. Perfect. So here are some other important benefits of the training. Why spend more money and more time to do this? Well, obviously, as a risk management tool, it remains important for that. The workplace harassment training can form the cornerstone of an affirmative defense that cities and other public entities can use if they're ever accused in a lawsuit of workplace harassment. But I would query, is standard AB 1825, 1661 harassment training every 2 years enough to establish that affirmative defense? I don't think so.
Probably not anymore.
I don't think so anymore. I think if you want to be able to establish that you've done everything in your power as an organization to prevent it, you're going to have to be able to show we went above and beyond the legally mandated requirements.
It's also a lot cheaper than a lawsuit or a settlement, frankly speaking.
Yeah, I tell my clients that pretty often. You can have me come out for a couple of $1,000 and that's going to maybe save you a few $100,000 down the road. So, building constructive professional relationships, identifying problems before they turn into lawsuits and PR crises, it's a great opportunity for that. And also, training's good public relations in general. Just to the same extent that you're building your commitment to zero tolerance for harassment, your commitment to diversity and inclusion in the workplace, your commitment to outstanding training on these issues is something that ought to be a part of your banner. It's something that you should be proud of, and it's something that you should use to market and promote your city or your agency.
And people are often asking, and I'm sure you're getting this from constituents, but people are asking, what are you doing? What can we do? This is such an easy first step to take, and it can catapult a total cultural change, and that is fabulous PR.
And if you do good training with good trainers, and especially if you serve lunch, you can get a really good crowd and turn it from being this eye-rolling, groaning out loud, we have to go to harassment training again, to a brown bag discussion about implicit bias in the workplace, where, it's not just some lawyer standing up in front of the group droning on and on about the elements of a sexual harassment claim, but really having those candid conversations about things where the employees are active participants in the discussion. I mean, I think that's the best training there is.
And also that inevitably has these employees talking about you know, the different things that their employer, this agency, is doing for them. And that's another form of PR, is employees talking about their experience working for you.
All right, so let's move on to the next slide, actions with impact. What are some things that we can do, some basic fundamental things that will potentially have a big impact? Well, lead by example. Treat other people with dignity and respect. Your employees will see that. You hold yourself to those standards. Your staff and your employees are more likely to do that as well. Publicly acknowledge your commitment to these principles in the workplace and hold people accountable when their conduct does not meet the standards that you've established. On to the next slide. We've already talked about, looks like I missed one here. Oh, okay, here we go. Adopting a resolution that affirms your city or your agency's commitment to diversity and inclusion and belonging and zero tolerance for harassment really gets that message out to the public as well as to the staff. Maybe think about updating your core values or your mission statement to include those ideas. We've already talked about the climate survey. Maybe think about investing in some alternate complaint mechanisms. Most workplace policies say that an employee can report harassment to any manager or supervisor they're comfortable with or directly to human resources, but still not always people are comfortable with that. So maybe it's a hotline or some kind of a phone or a text system that's made available to employees. So on to the next slide.
Lady, I have a question.
Okay, what's our question?
This question is from Suzanne. Is there any recommendations regarding whether to make the climate surveys anonymous or not?
So, you know, it's a really good question. Yeah. You know, I think you might get more candid, honest feedback if it's done anonymously. There may be a way to set up the survey so that you know what departments the feedback is coming from, so that you can identify particular problem areas or weak spots within the organization, but you'll probably get better feedback if it's anonymous.
And there are other identifiers you can put, like how long have you been here, you know, what level are you, so you can kind of target a little bit more about where the issues are, but I think Tracy nailed it. You're going to get your most honest answers if people are feeling like they can anonymously explain themselves.
And by the way, if anybody wants to get in touch with me and Lauren because they're interested in doing a climate survey, we'd be more than happy to talk further offline about that and maybe to point you to some samples that we've looked at that we think are really good.
Absolutely, and the same goes for updating those mission statements or for developing some sort of reporting system. These are things that we're touching on here, but they really do have to be tailored to your organization, and we're happy to help with that.
Yeah. Okay. So
great. Thank you, ladies. I also got information from the league that you can click on the Q&A box on your right-hand corner, double-click it. You should be able to see different views and should be able to see the Q&A question. If not, also try the little drop-down arrow next to the Q&A box. If you click on that, you should be able to see the Q&A questions as well. So go ahead and try that if you could. But go ahead. I'll do it again.
So the screen view that I have doesn't seem to have what you're describing on it.
Got it. No Q&A box on the top right-hand corner, the blue one?
Nope, there's no Q&A box on our view.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so but thanks for jumping in and keep those questions coming if you're able to see them from your end. We do appreciate that.
I will.
So moving on to our next slide on actions with impact. You know, we've talked about putting your money where your mouth is. Budget for training and then make it mandatory. And then, you know, maybe even consider for your supervisor performance evaluations incorporating a segment there on did they attend their training and have they implemented what they learned. Adopting council norms. As a litigator, I am more and more frequently starting to see allegations being made against our elected and appointed officials, both based on their conduct towards each other as well as their conduct towards staff. So really working with our agency officials on appropriate decorum and interaction with staff can be important as well. On the next slide, some more ideas. holding office hours.
We've heard that some people are doing this, and it really can and should be policy across the board, because it does create an environment where people can tip you off to what issues are going on that you don't know about.
Yeah, and it just, when you work in an organization where the person in charge is unavailable, unapproachable, has their door closed, you can't ever get a meeting scheduled, that doesn't foster the kind of communication that we're looking for, and it doesn't really help that message trickle down.
Absolutely.
When somebody who's in charge of an organization has an open door, they have office hours that are available to employees to stop by and chat about whatever they want to talk about. That's how really good leadership gets the message across, and it's how employees see leaders living what they're preaching to their employees and to their staff.
And I know that at this level, I'm sure a lot of you don't remember what it might be like to be an entry level or a, rank and file workforce member, but it can be a lot to send out an email, ask for a meeting, schedule that time. That's kind of scary for some people in the work environment, to be able to know that they can just pop into an office and that is exactly what you're there for at that time really is powerful.
So some other things that can really be helpful is getting employee buy-in by having them get involved with drafting policy language and helping identify areas, and this could come through a climate survey where there's an opportunity to create policy that address a particular problem. Another idea is being a little bit more public about what is being done to address harassment complaints. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, and certainly there are some confidentiality and privacy issues involved, but maybe we want to start rethinking the kinds of things that we're willing to say and comment on or not comment. So more on that in a few minutes. And then I think with respect to our, local agency officials, and this applies to managers and supervisors as well, take a look at how much workplace harassment costs, whether it is in terms of dollars or intangible costs, like damage to someone's reputation or to your organization. That can oftentimes translate into changing the way an organization works. So on the next slide, the message to employees really needs to be clear, and across the board for employees and supervisors. There's got to have to be a no tolerance policy. The policy needs to be regularly updated, disseminated, and acknowledged and talked about, and that's the kind of thing that, could be an appropriate subject for one of those tailgate meetings or brown bags that we were talking about earlier. Focusing on encouraging bystander intervention, really trying to address workplace conflicts before they turn in to bullying or harassment type of allegations, not ignoring or condoning the behavior, chalking it up to, this is just the way so-and-so behaves, sweeping it under the rug, turning a blind eye to it. And then perhaps the final point here is making sure employees know that they're not going to be retaliated against if they come forward. One of the reasons that people don't make these complaints is because they don't want to be seen as unable to get along. They don't want to be considered someone who rocks the boat. They don't want, their peers to think they're unable to go along with things. And so that really can be a deterrent. And so for them to understand that their complaint will be taken seriously and that retaliation is prohibited by the policy and the law can go a long way.
And maybe even knowing the message, we expect to receive complaints. That doesn't mean everything will be substantiated. That doesn't mean everything, will be a huge pervasive issue, but we expect to receive them. That means people will feel empowered to say, this is something I should be doing.
So our next slide is a hypothetical. We are going to go ahead and skip this hypothetical as well as a few others that are going to pop up as we go through the material. We're starting to run a little short on time. I believe everybody has access to these materials. The hypotheticals don't necessarily have right and wrong answers. Well, that's not true. There are definitely wrong answers. But the point of the hypotheticals really is just to get you reading them and thinking about, wow, that sounds like something that could happen happened or has happened in my organization? Did we handle it right, or what would be the right thing to do? So I will leave those to you guys to read in your copious free time and think about when you have some time. So with that, we will move into the next slide, which takes us into the next segment. And that is responding to workplace allegations of harassment and discrimination. And then we're going to talk a little bit about appropriate interim measures and then investigations. Investigations are a tool that's available to employers to help get to the bottom of the problem. They're also legally mandated in some circumstances, and they provide a very significant cornerstone of a public agency's defense when it wants to discipline or take other action based on the findings in response to an allegation. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, knowing the complaint procedures. It's very important that your employees be educated about how to make a complaint. Almost every time I go into the workplace and do a workplace harassment training session, I ask employees, and this could be regular employees or it could be managers and supervisors, how many of you have read your city or your agency's harassment policy? Rarely does anybody's hand actually go in the air.
And if it does, I wonder when the last time they read it was.
Either it was when they were onboarded during the orientation process, or they recently got in trouble for violating it and it was attached to a Skelly notice. The policies aren't effective if nobody's read what's in it. The reality is most people, when they're hired, get an employee handbook or a set of personnel rules or copies of some key policies. They acknowledge it and they hand the thing back. They've never actually read it. So really making sure that employees sit down and read that material and, again, brown bag discussion.
Absolutely. And if they have questions, they can ask them instead of it being too late.
So really making sure that people understand what the procedure is, who they can talk to, and understanding that, they don't have to be within the chain of command. And, the city can't address a problem it doesn't know about, and so encouraging that reporting as well.
And also as a supervisor, understanding that just because someone's not your direct report doesn't mean the harassment you've noticed is not your problem, because it is.
Yeah. Okay, so on the next slide, investigations. There's lots of reasons to do them. For those of you who don't already know this, they are legally mandated anytime an employee uses the magic words harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. They're also important because they can help identify and resolve a problem at the local level before this gets escalated up to a state or federal agency or worse, into court. It also conveys to your employees that you do take complaints seriously and that you're going to comply with your own policies, and that helps instill trust by the employees in your policies. And it's also, as I mentioned before, something that you can use as a legal defense in the event you have to defend yourself in a workplace harassment or discrimination type case. So on the next slide, when is that legal duty triggered? So as I mentioned, anytime an employee uses the magic word, harassment, discrimination, or retaliation, you have to do it then. If you've learned about an allegation of harassment, discrimination, or retaliation through the EEOC, that's a federal agency, or our state agency, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, you are still required to conduct an investigation, even if the agency is doing their own investigation. You're also required to conduct an investigation whenever a manager or supervisor is aware or should be aware of that problem. And that's true even if the magic words aren't used. So an employee may come in and say, this other person that I work with is engaging in this pattern of behavior, and, I think it's because of my race or the way that I look. They haven't said the word harassment, but...
They haven't said discrimination.
And they haven't said discrimination, but they've given you enough information to understand that it could fall into that umbrella, which means you have to do an investigation.
That's where common sense is very important.
All right, so on to the next...
question.
Okay.
Okay, so this question is from Shannon. How do you handle a council member claiming another council member is harassing them? They are unlike other employees in terms of discipline.
Yeah, this is a very difficult area, and we are starting to see some emerging trends. When the legislature mandated this workplace harassment training for local elected officials, I think it signaled that there is going to be a change coming to how we define and treat our elected officials. Currently, you're right, elected officials are not employees. They are not managers and supervisors for most of the staff. They may be to a city attorney or to a city manager or someone who serves at the pleasure of the governing board. So other than those unique circumstances, they're not necessarily protected by workplace harassment laws. But yet, if an elected official was harassing a staff member, they could certainly be creating liability for the agency. As far as I know, there is not yet any California Court of Appeal or Supreme Court decision that specifically addresses the council member on council member harassment. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be dealt with. You're right, there is no way to discipline someone for that conduct, but there may be some other tools that you can consider, short of, someone being removed from office or resigning from their position. For those of you who may be a member of a JPA or some other risk management pool, it's not uncommon for those types of agencies to send folks out to do council training, to help develop council norms and conduct guidelines that ensure that elected and appointed officials are behaving in a way that brings credit to the organization they serve and the communities and constituencies they serve.
And sometimes reminding them of the messaging of the city and the requirements of the city and allowing them to undergo that training can be a really powerful reminder, even though discipline can't necessarily take place.
Yeah, and another good way to do that, show them what it costs to settle a sexual harassment lawsuit. Constituents don't tend to look very favorably on that when they end up footing the bill for a lawsuit that was caused by an elected official's own misconduct. So very good question. Again, if that's something that you want to chat about offline, we're happy to talk a little bit more about some of our experiences that we've had dealing with councils in those kinds of situations. All right, so on to the next slide then. There's lots of different circumstances involving employee misconduct generally that could lead to an investigation. It's typically a best practice to conduct an investigation anytime there may be an underlying violation of your rules or policies. So on to the next slide. What are the benefits of a well-done investigation? Well, like I said earlier, it does provide for an affirmative defense that you can use if you ever are sued for workplace harassment or discrimination. And as long as the investigation was done in good faith and the employer relies in good faith on the findings of that investigation, the employer may be insulated from liability for taking action based on the investigation, even if the jury disagrees with the outcome of the investigation. So it's got a lot of power as a tool in legal proceedings. It also shows a jury or a decision maker that you did, in fact, take this issue seriously and you made a good faith effort to get to the bottom of it. But keep in mind, in any litigation that involves an underlying workplace investigation, the investigation itself will go on trial. It is very common for human resource experts to be brought in to testify at trial. The employee plaintiff side expert will pick apart the investigation and ask questions about why wasn't this witness interviewed, why wasn't this evidence considered. The employer defense HR expert is likely to say, here's all the reasons why this investigation does actually pass muster. Some other benefits are that, it provides transparency in the community. Even if you don't end up sharing the final results, being able to publicly comment that it's being investigated enhances transparency. And as we've talked about earlier, it helps identify additional issues before they turn into legal problems. So on to the next slide. If you have a situation where you may need to do an investigation, you need to start strategically thinking about a number of different things. First of all, what are you going to do if the investigation uncovers additional instances of misconduct? You need to be prepared to separately investigate those and address those issues as they come up. It is not uncommon in a workplace investigation for once the witnesses start talking, all sorts of additional problems and issues end up on the table. You may think that you're starting off investigating a workplace harassment issue, and then it turns out you've got some time card abuse and fraud by employees in another department. So you're going to need to be prepared to address everything that comes to your attention. And if that misconduct involves legal compliance, what you're going to do in response to it to correct and remedy any legal noncompliance. When it comes to conducting an investigation, I just want to remind and caution everybody that emails between HR and managers, managers and managers, city managers and members of a council are not privileged. So when you're having internal discussions about any employee issue or allegation or investigation, try to limit your written communications because they may ultimately have to be produced in subsequent litigation. Better, if you don't want to have to produce those kinds of communications, to at least copy your city attorney or your outside labor and employment counsel so that you can start by, start from the presumption or at least with an argument that those communications are privileged.
And those are different than documentation, because documentation, which Tracy will talk about, is very, very important. But email communications that aren't documentation will definitely become an exhibit number 1 in a lawsuit if it comes to that point.
Okay, so on the next slide, determining the nature of the allegations. Not every employee complaint is a workplace harassment complaint that is required by law to be investigated. Now, any type of employee conflict issue needs to be addressed. And sometimes an investigation is warranted. But you really need to hear what the employee is saying and what it is they're alleging the problem is, and then decide, does this fit in the sexual or workplace harassment or discrimination bubble, or are we talking about something else? Because that may dictate ultimately how you end up responding to it. You're going to need to evaluate what internal policies may be implicated under these circumstances, how widespread is the problem, what's the relationship between the people who are involved, and then finally, do you need to talk to your legal counsel? Almost always the answer on something like that is yes. I think the sooner you start strategizing with your legal counsel about how to address these issues in a way that, one, resolves the problem effectively for the employees, and two, sets up, a defense for the employer in the event you end up in litigation, always a good idea. So our next slide is a hypothetical. Like I said, we're going to go ahead and skip that, and you can read it on your own time. And we'll move on to the next slide, what to do when you receive a complaint. There's a lot of different ways a complaint can be made. Some key tips here: try to take it in a private place. Having this discussion in public around the lunchroom in a common area is not typically the right place to have it. Make sure the person receiving the complaint is listening and not interrupting, not jumping to conclusions, not rushing to judgment, but actually hearing the employee out, taking notes, and then recapping those notes back to the employee to make sure they've gotten the important points, and then asking appropriate follow-up questions as necessary. On the next slide, a few tips for managers and HR staff about what not to do. Putting off a discussion is rarely the best way to deal with a problem. I have never seen a problem that's gone ignored tend to resolve itself. Don't make promises about any particular outcome. There is a process that needs to be gone through to determine what the outcome is going to be, so important that you're not saying, hey, so-and-so is going to get fired over this. You don't want to make those judgments too early on. There's no reason to discuss an employee complaint with people who don't have a need to know about it. Sometimes managers are friends with other managers and they go to lunch and there's this juicy piece of gossip about a staff member because they've complained. Well, just because it's a juicy piece of gossip doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be discussed. And in fact, having those conversations sometimes can lead to additional claims by the employees. So keeping things confidential is important.
Also, really not interrupting and letting the person fully explain, because sometimes we might jump to conclusions that either don't exist or overlook problems that are already there. So ask questions to clarify, but don't interrupt.
All right, so let's move on to the next slide, some things to avoid, common pitfalls. We've already talked about a lot of these, so I'm just going to hit a few of them. Blanket gag orders can be a problem. There's been some recent guidance from the NLRB in the private sector and PERB here in California that says a gag order to all witnesses and parties to an investigation may be unlawful. You can, in many cases, still advise employees that they need to keep the investigation confidential, but you have to do that on a case-by-case basis, and you need to be able to articulate a legitimate reason for why you're going to tell employees that they can't talk to anybody else about the investigation. So let's move on to the next slide, which is a hypothetical. Oh, no, sorry, I guess I skipped ahead here. So failing to investigate, what are the problems that can cause? Well, it's against the law if it's a legally required investigation. In fact, failure to investigate and correct allegations of harassment is its very own cause of action under California law. Where an employer has failed to investigate or they've done a bad job investigating, that is a case where the facts are likely to be in dispute, which means it's unlikely that the employer can get out of a lawsuit at summary judgment, which puts an employer in the position of either having to try the case to a jury or settle it, neither of which are a good place for an employer to have to be in. But there's lots of other, problems with it as well. It discourages complaints. It loses an opportunity to resolve problems before they turn into lawsuits. If you have a disciplinary appeal procedure in your city or your agency, failing to adequately investigate can sometimes undermine your discipline. And in legal cases, it can certainly be evidence of ratification of that behavior. So lots of reasons to do them and do them right. All right, so our next slide is a hypothetical. We're going to go ahead and skip over that and move on to the next slide, understanding who the allegations are against and what to do when they involve a high-level employee, such as a council member, the director of human resources, the city manager. When the allegations are against someone like that, obviously those are the most notable kind of allegations, or the type of things that the press likes to get a hold of, and those ones need to be treated with special care. There likely is going to be a very limited universe of people who need to know or be involved in the process. Most likely in a situation like that, you're going to want to use an outside investigator to come in and take a neutral look at things and issue their fact-finding, rather than having someone internal in the organization who may potentially be subject to various influence do it.
And that also is part of not only is that important for the neutral fact-finding, but also for your messaging and for your media strategy, which we'll touch on, but we might not have too much time to talk about, so I wanted to interject that neutral fact-finder should be a huge part of your message to the public.
Yes, absolutely. So on the next slide, communicating with the people involved. How much do you tell the person who made the complaint, the person who the complaint is against? What do you tell witnesses about it? What, if anything, do you share with the governing body? Well, that all depends on what the case involves. I believe that the accused, and certainly if you're dealing with police or fire, there are specific rights that they have. But generally, a good practice is to let the accused know the nature of the allegations against them. Witnesses don't need to know necessarily as much information, but it's not effective to bring them into a room for a sit-down interview without giving them any kind of heads up about what it's about. A governing body may need to know some information about the investigation if, for example, there's going to be some kind of a negotiated early resolution. If the investigation involves a council member that's been made by, where the complaint has been made by a staff person, communicating that information to the council member or to the governing body as a whole could potentially create a retaliation type scenario. So you're going to have to navigate those issues very carefully and on a case-by-case basis.
And also think about if a reporter asks this person to comment, what are they going to say and how is that going to affect the case?
All right, so on the next page, assessing potential interim actions. When you've had a workplace allegation of harassment or discrimination, there are a number of things that you may want to consider doing in the interim. If there is some risk of ongoing harassment or retaliation as a result of the complaint, you may want to consider separating people. You most certainly are going to want to secure relevant information if you have a email retention policy that deletes emails after 30 days, but this investigation may take longer than that. You're probably going to need to undertake some efforts to make sure that the material is being retained. So on to the next slide, administrative leave is an important tool. Certainly, in any situation where the outcome of the investigation may lead to termination or severe discipline, admin leave is appropriate. If you're in a situation where the person accused of the misconduct is likely to engage in more misconduct or intimidate witnesses or retaliate against the person reporting the problem, admin leave may be a valuable tool for you to consider as well. On the next slide, some additional interim actions, temporary reassignments. You can do that. Sometimes the person complaining about the misconduct will actually ask for a reassignment. If that request can be accommodated, I'm not opposed to granting it, but you want to be very careful to ensure that there's not any perceived retaliation. You wouldn't want to move somebody into a demotion type role or dock their pay or take away their responsibilities. So it can be done, it just needs to be done carefully.
Very case-by-case basis.
Should the complainant be placed on admin leave? Not unless they ask to be. I have had some situations where, the person coming forward has said, look, this is also stressful to me. I don't want to be here. I need some time away. I'd like to go out on admin leave while this gets resolved. If they've asked for it,
right,
you may want to consider granting that. You don't have to necessarily, but what they're signaling to you is that they're uncomfortable with the current circumstances and need some kind of accommodation. So if you're not going to put them out on admin leave, then maybe think about a temporary reassignment or some change in the reporting structure.
Or some sort of work from home or work from a different location. Very case-by-case basis.
Okay, so the next slide is a hypothetical that we're going to skip over and you can read on your own time, which takes us to the next slide, the EEOC requirements. The federal government has issued a comprehensive set of guidelines that mandate what must go in an investigation and what it has to include. They have to be prompt, impartial, confidential. You need a trained investigator. It needs to be thorough. There has to be proper questioning of witnesses, and the investigation needs to make a factual finding or determination of the events. So on the next slide, talking about who's going to do the investigation. In some cases, having someone inside your agency or your city do the investigation is appropriate, but there are other cases where it probably should be outsourced, like we mentioned earlier, an allegation against a high-ranking official. regardless of who does it, if it's in-house, it's important that there not be a reporting relationship between the people involved and the person conducting the investigation. The investigator should not be involved in the disciplinary decision and ideally not have much experience with the people who are involved in the issues. I know with some of our smaller cities and agencies that can be difficult to avoid. The next slide is hypothetical. I will leave that to you to read on your own time. And let's focus on outsourcing the investigation. There are a number of essential things that you want to be looking for when selecting an outside investigator. I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of these because as a litigator, these are the things that I see repeatedly coming up. That is excellent writing skills and how they present as a witness. As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the investigation itself goes on trial. So you have to have a well-written report and a good investigator who is going to be a key witness at a deposition, a disciplinary appeal hearing, or potentially at trial. So when you are vetting your investigators, you need to elicit that kind of information from them. How many times have you done this? Have you done this kind of an investigation before? Are you familiar with specific rules that may apply, for example, with police and fire? How many times have you testified in deposition? How many times have you testified in court? All right. On to the next slide, keeping it in-house. I think we've already hit those points, so let's move on to vetting the investigator on the next slide. There is an organization called the Association of Workplace Investigators. That is what is considered the gold standard for workplace investigators. I assure you any competent plaintiff's attorney will ask the investigator if they're a member, so make sure that they are. Take some time to go through writing samples and check their references. Sometimes an investigator has done a great job for one city and they're well liked, but they've done an inadequate job for another city. So really spend some time checking those folks out. Keep in mind that hiring the least expensive person doesn't always get you the best results. That said, hiring the most expensive attorney investigator on the market doesn't necessarily get you the best results either. Which also raises the problem of, okay, well, we have an investigator that we really like to work with. So far, they've always sided with our city on every issue, and they're reasonably priced. Can't we just keep using them every time? Well, you can imagine that on cross-examination at trial or in a deposition, they're going to be asked, how many investigations have you done for this city? And how much has this city paid you in connection with all of those investigations? Oh, really? $300,000 the city has paid you. For those $300,000, have you ever found in favor of an employee? And if the investigator's answer to that is no, certainly their neutrality is going to be undermined. So our next slide is a hypothetical, which I'll leave to you to read on your own time. And let's talk about defining the appropriate scope. A problem that we frequently see come up is what we like to call scope creep, and that is where additional issues come to light during the investigation, but the investigator fails to communicate that to the city, and then you see references to additional issues pop up in the report that are outside of what you thought the investigator was looking into. So really important that you have a written retainer that defines that scope and that you have a mechanism in place for regular verbal communication with your investigator to make sure that they are staying on scope. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about documentation. Remember that the investigation report needs to have findings that are sufficient to establish good cause for any disciplinary action that you may want to take. The investigator must find by a preponderance of the evidence, that means it is 51% likely that a fact happened or did not happen. Now, when the investigator makes the finding, they need to show their work. They need to be able to explain how they reached that finding. And if you have all of that in place, you should be able to establish in front of a decision-making body that any discipline or remedial action you took was consistent and fair under your policies. So on the next slide, a couple of comments. Oh, I guess I missed one. So, do you want your investigators reporting on policy or legal violations? Probably not. There may be a rare circumstance where you want them opining on that or making recommendations, but most often all you want is for your investigator to make a factual finding. This thing happened or this thing did not happen. That leaves you as the city flexibility to craft your own decision about whether the policy was violated and what action you want to take in response. So on to the next slide, which are some common pitfalls. Draft reports can be a problem. As a litigator, I don't like to see a lot of draft reports flying back and forth over email. Even in a case where you may be starting from the assertion that the report is subject to some kind of attorney-client privilege or work product, in litigation, it's not uncommon for the privilege to be waived and for drafts and those attaching emails where comments on the report may be going back and forth have to be produced. So be very careful with that. I generally prefer to see investigators working from one master document, and to the extent they're taking feedback or getting input, just dropping it directly into one document. Be careful about footers in a document that shows something as version 1, 2, or 3. That's basically handing cross-examination or discovery requests to the other side. They're going to want to know what was in those prior versions. So I think the rest of the content on that slide is fairly self-explanatory. So let's move on. The next slide is a hypothetical, which you can read on your own. And we'll take a look at the next slide, which are different levels of discipline. And so this ties into creating the appropriate remedial response, which is a legal obligation you have once you find out you have a harassment or discrimination problem. Figuring out what the right response is tricky, and it depends on what happened. Who was involved? What are the facts? What was their relationship? All of that sort of analysis needs to go into it. The general rule of thumb is that if somebody's engaged in that behavior before, obviously your prior corrective action was not sufficient. So it's time to move on to something more severe. But there's a pretty wide range of potential outcomes available to you. I do note the time. We're just starting to wrap up here. We have a handful more slides. Annie or other folks at the league on the line, do you want us to go ahead and plow through and folks can stay on if they'd like to continue?
I'm good with that.
Okay. I know we had a little bit of a delay there with the technology earlier, and I don't want to cut it too short if folks are interested in staying on. So for those of you who can continue, feel free to jump on. For those of you who, for time limitation reasons, need to jump off, it's been great having you. Our contact information is in the program if there's anything that you want to talk further with us about. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, which are some common problems that come up when it comes to crafting an appropriate response. One is that you need the punishment to fit the crime. The level of discipline needs to correspond to the seriousness of the allegations. I think there has been a reluctance in a lot of workplaces for many years now to actually pull the trigger on terminations or serious discipline when it comes to harassment allegations. I think the trend needs to be in the other direction. You're going to be making your decision based on an investigation that substantiated the allegations, and that should empower employers to make those hard decisions to actually terminate someone's employment. You know, it's an unfortunate position to be in because you are required to take appropriate remedial action, but it doesn't get you off the hook legally when you fire the wrongdoer either. But what it does do is look more favorable in front of a jury when you have your decision maker in the witness stand testifying, look, we did take this seriously. We weren't going to tolerate it. I wish I had known about it sooner, and we fired the wrongdoer as soon as we did our investigation and learned that that's what was going on. So
it is helpful and substantiated if you did do things like we talked about earlier, like your climate surveys, like maybe having a smaller measure, whether it's counseling or coaching someone. All saying that you've, really engaged in those preventative processes also helps when you're up on that stand saying why you terminated someone.
Yeah. And, you want your discipline to be consistent with your past practices, unless your past practices have been to sweep it under the rug and ignore it. Those past practices need to be changed. But you want your discipline to send a message that you take your policies seriously, that you're committed to your zero-tolerance stance on workplace harassment. You want to send the message to employees that it's not going to be tolerated by anybody in the organization, and hopefully that will deter ongoing kind of behavior like that. If you have an investigation that's inconclusive, which shouldn't happen, I would really push back on an investigator who comes back with a lot of unsubstantiated, for lack of evidence type findings and ask them to work a little bit harder. But it does happen from time to time where the allegations just can't be substantiated one way or the other. There is some risk of over-disciplining in a scenario like that, but you still do have some flexibility. Even if the investigator is not able to conclude by a preponderance of the evidence that a certain fact happened, there may be enough in the report that shows either the manager or the employee allowed this problem to exist and get to the point where we've ended up now. And so there may be some room there to discipline, although it's certainly not risk-free when that happens. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, and that is the very dreadful subject of negotiating a resolution with someone. As a litigator, settling cases is not my favorite thing to do. It's very frequent that I work with an organization that is just adamant that they've done nothing wrong and they want to fight and see something through to the very end. Nothing wrong with that. I'm a litigator. I'm always down for the long haul on the fight, but sometimes you have to do the litigation economics and take a hard look at what is it going to cost to fight a disciplinary action through the appeal phase, through litigation, through a subsequent civil appeal when there is no certain outcome. The one thing that a negotiated resolution does is buy your peace, and it cuts off potential damages and it gets you certainty. I know that's a difficult decision to make, and one of the questions I get from clients all of the time is, well, if we settle this case or we pull back this discipline and allow somebody to resign in lieu of, what message does that send to our staff and to our employees? Well, it depends how you spin it, and it kind of depends what the backdrop of the incident is, but it could send the message to your employees that, you want this put to rest and you want everybody to be able to move forward and you're exiting someone who doesn't belong there. But I do understand and acknowledge the concern that it may send a message, oh, we'll just pay employees off. And I get why you don't want to do that. But this is a cost-benefit analysis, and, it's something that we have to do in many cases, and, we don't necessarily need to shy away from it, but understand that it is a tool that's in the box. All right, I think our next slide is another hypothetical for you to read on your own, and that will conclude me talking for a minute. I am going to turn this back over to Lauren, and she is going to do a very quick wrap-up on media strategies and crisis management, and we should be done in just another 5 minutes or so. So, Lauren, I'm going to have you kind of speed through these last slides.
No problem. So moving on to the next slide, Before developing your media strategy or messaging, it's really important to assess the impact. What are the consequences? What are the allegations and issues? Who is involved? We've talked about assessing the impact from a investigatory standpoint, but knowing that from a messaging and media standpoint is just as important. I'll move on to the next slide because we did talk about that a little bit. And once you really understand the impact or the issues, what's important is to know that the answer, it's not that simple, is an okay answer. You're going to be asked, whether it's by media, constituents, but internally, either way, you're going to be asked, was this true or false? Because that's the world we live in. But while facts in investigations can and often are true or false, actual allegations are rarely true or false. We know that there's the subjective conduct and there's an objective standard for sexual harassment. That also goes for retaliation and discrimination claims. But disbanding of the notion that one side of a story is true or false will actually help your media strategy because it will be able to give you the tools to say to somebody who's asking you questions, it's not that simple. And that's actually an okay.
This is actually really complicated, which is why we've brought in a neutral outside person to conduct an independent evaluation of the facts.
Exactly.
Right?
Sometimes knowing the answer is not the right answer because you're jumping to conclusions one way or another. Moving on to the next slide, that kind of goes right into to comment or not to comment. That is the question. The standard used to be no comment because you didn't want to trip yourself into liability.
Yeah, you don't want to accidentally say something or deliberately say something to the media that gets used against you in the lawsuit.
Exactly. But what no comment has sort of turned into is the reader or reviewer of that saying, we don't take this seriously, we're denying it, we're not sure if it's real, we don't think it happened.
Right.
And as we know now, those comments are often inaccurate. We talked about how, 2 to 6% of allegations are fully made up, but they're also not popular. That's not the messaging that you want to disseminate to anybody, and that really often doesn't stand with the mission statement of any of your agencies. So sometimes it's appropriate to not comment, but most often the comment is exactly what Tracy said. We're taking this seriously. It's important to give people who are going to be your media contacts some information. First is whether or not you've started your investigation. Second is whether or not it's internal or external. Third is, whether or not remedial measures have been taken. Now, that doesn't mean saying what measures have been taken or what's going on in the investigation, but sometimes just giving those facts, this is happening, this is happening, this is not happening, are enough for a reporter or somebody who's contacting you from the media to feel satisfied that your city or your agency is doing your due diligence.
And it helps balance out the fact that plaintiffs and their counsels are giving comprehensive statements and narratives to the media. So you have to say enough to counter that without inadvertently stepping into a trap by saying too much.
Exactly. And also it's really important to make sure you talk to your employees about information. That's on a case-by-case basis, but basically giving them protocol. If you get media contact, refer it to this person. And that's often in your employee handbook as well. Going to the next slide very briefly, talking about engaging in social media. This, again, should align with your messaging to general media contacts. No need to respond to every comment, but to sort of have a general landscape of where you are in your investigation is important to be able to respond to. Moving on to the next slide. Rumors and gossip are inevitable, and that's I did mention this before, but understanding what is public knowledge already, knowing what your policy says for employees about what to do when they hear about these issues, who is your media contact, and what the protocol is if a reporter calls a random person that works for you. So limiting who is out speaking will also help hopefully limit your gossip and rumors. But again, that no comment invites rumors and gossip like no other. moving on, we're going to let you talk about that hypothetical on your own. I think Tracy did talk about the confidentiality of investigations and reports. Do you want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, let me just very briefly say that we all like to think that workplace investigations are confidential and that those reports are privileged and they're never going to see the light of the day. False. Once you end up in litigation, you almost always have to waive privilege because you have to rely on the report to defend yourself. In the public records context, some of you may recall back in 2012, there was the Markin versus Santa Monica Unified School District where an accused submitted a Public Records Act request to get a copy of the report about him, and the court granted his request. We are starting to see those privacy protections being chipped away, both under the Public Records Act with respect to our general concept of privacy of personnel records, and because the attorney-client privilege has to be waived if you want to rely on it in litigation, which is why I always say think about the end game starting at the beginning.
And that also relates back to your media strategy, because these reports will inevitably be disseminated in some way. So make sure you're thinking, what am I putting in here, and can it be published in some manner?
Good point.
Moving on to the next slide. I think Tracy touched on this, so we'll move on.
Yeah. So I'll just real quick, some practice pointers on privilege. When you're hiring an outside attorney to conduct the investigation, writing a retainer agreement requires some very specific language. This issue was addressed in the case against City of Petaluma a year or two ago, and it has become very important in light of the Petaluma case to make your retainer with your investigators very clear so that you at least have an argument to start with that the material is privileged. Just remember that the attorney-client privilege doesn't necessarily cover every communication. It doesn't cover every email you send. It doesn't cover pre-existing documents that are emailed to an attorney. It only covers legal advice given by the attorney to the client. If that advice is shared with people that don't have a need to know, if it's not treated confidentially, likely the privilege has been waived. So if you want to utilize the attorney-client privilege as a strategic tool, you need to be smart about how you're doing it.
That's also, it's important to loop in your legal contact, your HR contact, and your PR contact together so everybody's really clear on the impacts and necessities of each department as you're moving through an allegation.
So let's go ahead and skip ahead to these next couple of slides. I think we've addressed the practice pointers on privilege, so we'll skip ahead here. And this will be our final slide where we wrap up. What do you share with the governing body? Well, as we talked about a little bit earlier, it depends. Do you need your counsel's approval to take your next step? If so, you may have to brief them in closed session about the particular issue or the outcome of the investigation. If the allegations involve a council member, you're going to have to be careful about what you say. How much information provided is enough?
And also, sometimes really simple information, like I was talking about before. We are moving forward with this investigation. This private investigator, or we're using a private investigator. Remember the facts that you can share and really rely on those instead of trying to either not share anything or overshare information.
So with that, we are almost done. That was our final content slide. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties that we had there at the beginning. We appreciate you bearing with us through that and sticking with the presentation. We hope you found this information useful, and there's a message there that you can take back to your organizations. Like we've said, if there's anything that you'd like to chat with Lauren and I about, we're happy to do that offline. We apologize that we weren't able to personally see the questions as they were coming in today. Thank you to the league staff for helping us navigate those technical issues. Thanks again from me and Lauren.
Thank you so much.
I'll turn it back over to the league staff to wrap us up.